Maine. I would like to just take this time to honor all of those who are in the healing profession gathered here today and who are also advocates. We as a team want to acknowledge all the loss that you may have experienced during COVID, maybe directly from COVID, and the health loss from COVID and the impact from COVID, both personally and professionally. Then I'd just like to ask everybody, as we gather in this space together, we'll just do a brief exercise together, right where you are, just to be present. And I ask that you either soften your gaze, or if you're comfortable, just close your eyes. And this will be extremely familiar to most of you gathered here. But I ask that you just start with taking 3 breaths, just nice cleansing breaths at your own speed. And if you happen to be sitting, as many of us are, please notice where your feet are on the floor. Maybe press your feet into the floor. Just notice that sensation, that groundedness right there of a solid floor beneath you. Or if you're standing, notice that as well. For those of you sitting, please notice where your seat is. Just feel if it's on a chair or a bench or wherever you happen to be seating, just notice that right now. As you continue just to breathe deeply and mindfully. Then I ask you to please notice where your hands are right now. Maybe they're together, maybe they're resting on your chair, maybe they're resting on your legs. Just notice them. Notice if they feel a little cool, warm, damp. Just notice. Then I invite you to bring your attention to your heart. Just notice your heart space as you breathe. Just notice. Then I invite you to bring your attention to anything that you hear around you. Just notice any sounds for what they are. And maybe you're noticing silence. And now I invite you to take 3 deep breaths, cleansing, slow, deep breaths. And just gently refocus your gaze, open your eyes, refocus your gaze. Then I'll turn this back to Ed.
Thank you. And let me first take you to a very different place. I think it's hard for us to recall just what it was like in early 2020, in those first days of COVID. We had no treatments that really worked, no vaccines. We saw COVID strike other nations, and then we watched in horror as thousands of people died in Italy and other countries, and then here in the United States. It was clear that COVID was exceptionally dangerous for older people. And here we were, the oldest state in the nation. We knew it could be very rough here. My colleagues at the Maine Medical Association, Maine Association of Psychiatric Physicians, they asked me, could I help put together something to help support the front line as we faced COVID? And with that, we put out the word, and with the help of Maine NASW and other organizations, we soon had more than 100 volunteers stepping up. Next, please. We negotiated a relationship with Maine's Office of Behavioral Health, Maine Response, and other stakeholders. We trained and we organized 3 shifts of volunteers providing 12 hours of coverage a day, every day, as well as supervision and support for our volunteers. And we launched with some fanfare as the Maine Frontline Warm Line on April 21st, 2020. And here you see someone we were blessed to have here in Maine. This is Dr. Nirav Shah. I think an exceptionally calming and inspirational figure through COVID for a population that went through a lot together. Some of our stakeholders were perhaps not as competent or as honest as we hoped. And at the time that the front line most needed our help, we had difficulties with communication lines. We had media support that had been promised that never showed up. Still, our volunteers stepped up, they trained, they took shift, they took calls, and we, over that period, learned from every call, supported the effort of the front line, and we supported one another. Next slide. COVID really infected every part of life in Maine. Of course, our acute care hospitals were hit. Sick patients became critically ill, and too many of them died. But it also played out in emergency rooms, clinics, long-term care, and home care. There were many folks outside of healthcare that were having difficulty. Those folks doing emergency medical services, law enforcement. We came to appreciate over time the exceptional stress there was there on Maine's educators, teachers, and others who were trying to run their classes safely behind masks and yet support students at home at the same time, every day and every week, watching the students fall more and more behind. It soon became necessary for us to broaden our scope and to bring on educators, not just as folks we supported, but also as our volunteers. Next slide. Everyone in Maine was impacted. There was no one who could miss the reminders to mask up, to keep safe distances. Other volunteers and efforts stepped up, bringing much needed meals and supports into people's homes. Next slide. And Mainers embraced all of this and their frontline workers during this frightening, challenging time, giving private and public thanks to doctors and nurses and EMS, law enforcement, and educators. Next slide. Our calls made it clear just how hard it was for many on the front line. Long hours, too often little sleep, no rest. We heard from frontline staff stretched to the breaking point, not sure how they could continue for even one more day. And we did what we trained to do. We listened. We provided them with practical assistance. We helped them to consider their options and their supports. And just that little help that we could provide on the phone, that made a difference. And almost all of the callers we spoke with at the end of their call indicated they felt helped. They felt better prepared to carry on. It was an amazing experience for us. Next slide. So looking at that initial call from my colleagues and from others to support the front line, we did a major job. We had more than 150 volunteers stepping up to train, to work together, providing daily support, totaling more than 33,000 hours of volunteer effort. An amazing show of support. Next slide. And coming next is someone who is the architect and the engineer for helping prepare us all. Rich?
Thanks, Ed. This slide actually is not us. You could probably guess that. We use this metaphor routinely throughout the development of the Maine Frontline Warm Line, that we're building the plane while we're flying it. Largely, this had never been done. I don't know if you noticed the date on that last letter that Ed put up. That was March 20th. This was happening in unbelievably rapid time frame. One of the things that we were tasked with, given that we wanted to help, was what are we going to offer? How are we going to do that? And we had to select an approach that met a number of criteria. First and foremost, we needed a workable intervention that would satisfy both the stakeholders and us as the providers. It wasn't just making the stakeholders happy. We had to believe in it too. We did land on psychological first aid, PFA, which at the time, and I believe still currently, you could say this, is the most widely accepted standard of care in disaster response worldwide. It is easily and rapidly trained and adapted. For example, we had in our first run of people signing up for the Maine Frontline Warm Line, they were all licensed, independently licensed behavioral health providers. Because of that, the state authorized us to use an adapted, shortened version of PFA training. They did not have to go through the full PFA training through NCTSN, et cetera. And that was an accommodation by the stakeholder to allow us to do that, but we had to adapt the content. We were also doing the training online, which I will tell you, now Zoom seems like something very familiar, but at the time it was completely foreign. So we adapted it to an online training focus. And also, one of the other considerations is we didn't want to ask any of our volunteers to have to pay anything for the training, either ours or someone else's. PFA as an intervention, importantly, does not require a mental health background, which made it excellent when we were encouraged, allowed to invite our educational colleagues, educator colleagues into the Maine Frontline Warm Line. These are some of our most skilled providers. While they may not have a license in behavioral health, they've got vast experience in educating, which is part of what PFA does. In case you don't know much about PFA, I won't go into great detail, but it is an evidence-informed, modular, scalable approach designed to help in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, to reduce the initial distress and to foster short and long-term adaptive functioning and coping. And again, it can be adapted to a variety of settings. Importantly, PFA is a resilience-based model. It does not assume that all survivors will develop severe mental health in recovery. Instead, it's based on an understanding that disaster survivors and others, including responders, are affected by such events and may experience a broad range of early reactions: physical, psychological, behavioral, spiritual. Some of those reactions will cause enough distress to interfere with adaptive coping, and recovery may be helped by support from compassionate and caring disaster responders. I will just say that while we used PFA as taught by the NCTSN primarily, there are other models of PFA out there. Johns Hopkins has the rapid PFA model, which we looked at, what we couldn't get our folks trained in without additional cost and in a time frame. During COVID, the World Health Organization distributed a lovely manual, which I highly recommend, and it's free, Doing What Matters in Times of Stress, that was largely created by Russ Harris, a psychiatrist from Australia, very involved in the acceptance and commitment therapy discussion groups and writing. All of these resources are available to everybody. If you haven't been trained in psychological first aid, I would heartily recommend that you just participate in the training. It is free, it's online, it takes about 6 to 8 hours to complete. And that's psychological first aid. So that's where we started with the Maine Frontline Warm Line. You can see all the populations that we were serving: healthcare workers in every possible stretch of the imagination, EMS, firefighters, dispatch, law enforcement, and all the Maine educators as well. These are the core actions of PFA responders. It's not important to memorize these. We'll send out the slides later. But these are the basic 8 core actions that all PFA people are trained in. You don't necessarily have to do each one of these when you're having a call with someone who needs that support, or if you're in a resource center and you're actually meeting with someone face to face. But all of these are the basic skill sets of psychological first aid. And now back to, I think, Poppy and Ed.
Poppy?
Okay. These are, I guess these slides are going to be showing the four key components of the Maine Frontline Connection model. And when there's a disaster, people step up and people in the population feel called, and it's important to recognize and work with that. And the initial focus is on rapid entry, practical training, inclusion in a culture of ongoing skill building and readiness, and mutual respect and support. And one of the things I felt that was most important about the volunteer part was that it supported autonomy, that volunteers had the choice to decide which hours they wanted to work and their level of participation. And it was really based on strength competency. And so many of our volunteers came in trained with skills, with competencies, and many, many strengths. And this model supported that, and we all learned PFA together. Do you want to talk volunteer driven?
Sure. And because this is a volunteer driven model, this is not a model in which from the top down, people are told where they're going to be assigned, how many hours they're going to work. The rest of it, for all of our volunteers throughout the entire project, every volunteer decided for herself or for himself how much they were going to be volunteering, what shifts they wanted to do, when they would want to come in to be a part of our check-in process. All of these things were driven by the volunteers themselves. So this is a very different model from how some other responses were organized, but something that we think has really been helpful. If there are stakeholders, and there were stakeholders in our case, the model does support constructive collaboration. In Maine, we wanted to have effective coordination with the state. There were some things that the state was to provide for us. It didn't come through with everything that it said that it would, but did provide us, for instance, with liability protection for our volunteers. And I think that we're really in this model talking about a collaboration rather than a dictation by the organization. Next.
Whoops.
Frontline focus. And that was one of the most important elements of this model, that we were focusing on frontline personnel. And we wanted the focus to be low barrier, immediate, pragmatic support, responsive to the needs of those identified roles. And as Rich said earlier, the model that we used was not a clinical intervention. We had clinical backup if it was needed. But the purpose was to really understand who was on the front line and what support was needed from the front line, and recognize that it could change from moment to moment in terms of what was needed by frontline personnel. And it was what was needed in the moment. And I think one of a frontline focus is to be able to develop collaborative relationships with the people on the front line, so that we really know what they need and want. And sometimes that proved to be a little difficult with the Maine Frontline model, but it's highly recommended that in this model, you're able to network and really know what the front line wants. We can't assume what they want. They're working, they're providing the disaster response, they know what they need. Next slide.
And just to elaborate on that, even who the front line is something you learn, and something that we learned. And we were in the process of meeting the needs when we started to appreciate, started to hear just how important it was that educators and teachers and others get support. Then the fourth element, there is a culture that is absolutely essential to this sort of volunteer effort. And that culture is something that frequent contact with one another, investing time with one another, helps to build that appreciation for self and for others, a culture that includes self-care, care for peers, and then developing that individual sense of calling for yourself, what it is that you feel moved to do to contribute to the effort. This is something that we did through daily processes through most of the time that we were organized. Every 4 p.m., 7 days a week, we had members who were there available, helping to make sure that that culture was continuing to build, continuing to support each of us, and also giving us the opportunity to learn from each call. All of us have the opportunity to see what's working, what it is that might be needed. And next.
And could I just add one piece to that, Ed? I think an important piece is the intentionality of how all of this was set up. That really the intention was to take care of volunteers, and that the volunteer care is really fundamental in providing a sustainable resource. So it was the intentionality of all of these elements that's important.
Absolutely.
So this next slide says community outreach, and you have been hearing about how a warm line was developed, which meant that we were taking calls from people who knew about our resource. You've heard a little bit about the background and our training and all. So I learn anecdotally, so I'll share just a little story. Our offices were in our homes for most, if not all, of the work that we were doing. And I can remember standing in my kitchen one December day and my phone rang, and it was somebody, it was a disaster behavioral health coordinator who asked about the possibility of our warm line also meeting with groups of individuals that this person knew were needing some extra support. So because of the structure of the Maine Frontline Warm Line, because it was a fluid, living, breathing organization staffed by trained volunteers in touch with each other, daily check-ins, could reach out to each other. We had our contact information. I listened to what the ask was, and then I immediately probably picked up the phone and called Ed, or I just simply sent a message to the group that was sort of the leadership group, which we call the faculty of the Maine Frontline Warm Line. I said, what do you think? Can we expand? And ultimately we did. We flexed. We became a group that could also offer outreach. So we tapped into our existing base. We shared it with them. We saw the picture of the plane that Rich held up earlier. We were building this as we were flying this, and there was definitely a need. So we also were able to work as team members supporting different organizations in different aspects of the state where there was a need, where there wasn't really the ability to normalize the stress reactions that they might have been feeling based on these continued abnormal times of the pandemic. And so we were able to, as I said, reach out to and support several different organizations in different areas of the state. So that was a great benefit of Zoom, that we could reach out to people. And we found that to be effective. It also, well, we had feedback that it was effective from those groups that we organized, that we were able to support. And we met with them in some cases over a series of months. and in some cases, just a short period of time. But the feedback that we got from their leadership was that and from the individuals, what they felt it was helpful to just learn more about how to take care of themselves as they were in the all-important roles of taking care of others. It also, one more thing, I think I said this, but it allowed us to reach a greater number of people when we had several of us teaming together to meet with a group.
So any good metaphor is worth overusing. And if we're building the plane as we're flying it, one of the things we noticed in community outreach and in calls that we were receiving was that while frontline personnel, inclusively defined, are very good at their jobs, one of the things that we seem to struggle with is self-care. And we always use the metaphor of, when the oxygen masks come down, put yours on first. That was something that was a hard dynamic to flex with sometimes. Our frontline personnel are routinely asking a lot of themselves without either paying attention to self-care, or their self-care may not be supported in their work context. Back to you, Susie or Ed.
So we found that many of the organizations were on their own already figuring out how to support their people and how to respond to COVID. And there were organizations that, from leadership on down, was supporting resilience skills, was bringing their people together, were finding ways to provide the support throughout the organization. There were also hazards that came up, and not all organizations dealt with them equally well. And we're going to be talking about moral injury and about systemic betrayal. These were also issues that we could see at time to time. But again, there are many organizations that really did work really well, really did take great care of their people. And it was wonderful for us to see them and to learn from them. Next.
And Ed, can I just add something on that slide? For the organizations that did take care of their people and themselves, they also were grateful to be able to have the outreach so that it could, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but just normalize it. And also they could talk with each other and realize they weren't going through it alone, and other people were sharing some of these concerns.
So when we were building this from the ground up, one of the things that we knew we wanted to do from the very start of this was to pay attention to what we were doing and potentially contribute to the literature on disaster response somehow. As you can imagine, doing research in the context of a disaster is incredibly difficult. There is no control group. You don't want to tell one group to just wait over there for 3 months and then we'll see what no intervention does. What intervention to use, it's different whether it's a 3-year pandemic or a tornado that comes through a community or a bomb that goes off or shootings in Lewiston. They're all very subtly different, and it's not fair to say that one is the same thing as the other yet. We may be able to find some commonalities. The one that most easily comes up is that people feel overwhelmed in the distress. And that's what psychological first aid was about. What we were hoping to do was find out how it felt to our people to be providing the call-in service, because we really, while we asked callers, how did the call work for you? Every time we were asking them on the phone line, and that's not exactly an anonymous way of responding. Many of them might have been saying, oh, it was very helpful, when in fact it wasn't. We don't know that. But there really was a difficult methodology to try and approach. So we kept going back and forth on how we were going to best gather data to be able to go back to the disaster response community with and provide something useful. So now I go to Poppy.
Right. And I was just going to add one piece, Rich, that the pandemic was a new type of disaster. And there really was very, and even now, very little research, particularly about even setting up a warm line to take care of frontline volunteers. We also have seen very little in the literature about the lack of knowledge of the needs and the realities of the frontline workers during COVID. How do you provide support to volunteers who were trying to support the emotional needs of frontline workers? And how do you support your volunteers? So we had a lot to learn, and I think we still have a lot to learn during this process. I did just want to say that the research study is conducted with oversight from the Office of Research Integrity and Outreach of the University of Southern Maine. And I think, at least for me, and I think the whole team can say that the work of the Nocturnists, which you can see the slide here, strongly influenced our team to consider the use of narratives as a way to capture the experiences of volunteers participating in Maine Frontline Warm Line. And a nocturnist is a hospital-based healthcare worker who only works overnight. And the Nocturnists are an independent storytelling podcast. And the name of their show is called The Stories from the World of Medicine. And the first one aired in 2016. And they've recently done a series this fall on the shame in medicine, The Lost Forest. And the podcast shares stories about medicine, but most importantly, these are narratives spoken by healthcare workers about their humanness, their fragility, their weaknesses, their moral distress, and their strengths. And the Nocturnist aired a two-part series from March 20th to the 21st. And they put a call out for audio diaries, and 700 frontline workers responded. And the Library of Congress is now in the process of archiving all of these audio diaries. And there was a holiday special that aired December 22nd, 2020. And there were no words to that podcast. And all it was the humming of frontline workers humming Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. And I just re-listened to it and rewatched it recently, and it brought me to tears again. And when you think of narratives, they're just a really simple way to tell a story. It can be written, it can be spoken. It's usually presents, it's about a situation. It could be an understanding of series of events. And they're often rich and meaningful and powerful. And some narratives, as we know, are a platform for social and institutional change. And the nice thing about narratives, they contain characters and they speak about relationships. There's a setting and a storyline, a point of view, and they usually carry conflict and resolution. And each narrative has an individual style, but they're usually telling similar stories and common themes. And as we think about it, narratives played a really important aspect for the Maine Frontline Connection model. If we think about it, when Rich was talking about the PFA model, it is really strongly focused on the importance of narrative. We were asking frontline workers what they wished to share, what was their story. Narratives were always emphasized in our volunteer check-in model for training. We used prompts to explore, how did the call go? How was the call received by the caller? Then we asked how the volunteer did with the call, and most importantly, the volunteer story about their call experience. How did you feel about that? Also in check-in, we, the volunteers, used narratives and storytelling to share our own personal stories with COVID, with our life, how we were doing, how we were coping, and how are you doing? So narrative inquiry is really an established research orientation in the social sciences, and it does require qualitative analysis and reflection. And we start with a point of interest, and hopefully we end with some thoughtful and thought-provoking conclusions. So when we started the research project, we had really hoped to use a phonic recording platform to record our volunteer audio narratives, but we ran into some difficulties with the recording and the confidentiality of that service. So we ended up setting up Maine Frontline Connection survey questions. And we sent that out on a SurveyMonkey platform. And they served as prompts for the volunteers to share their stories. The first survey was sent out in 2022, and we wanted volunteers to think back to their time volunteering to the present. What was their story of participating with Maine Frontline Warm Line? And no matter how long they participated or how brief their involvement, whether they took 10 calls or no calls, we were really interested in the prominent aspects they felt were important when they participated during Maine Frontline Warm Line, and then after they had a time when the Maine Frontline Warm Line was no longer in our operation, how they felt about it at a later date. And the second survey we sent out in 2023, and that was really to further explore some themes and patterns around what contributed to our volunteers' successes. Why was it such an important experience for so many of us? And what were some of the aspects of volunteering for Maine Frontline Warm Line that were particularly difficult for volunteers? We really asked very limited demographic information, and the questions were open-ended, and there was no maximum length to any of the stories written. We really wanted people to be able to have the space and the space to write whatever story they wished. And we really didn't have a hypothesis, as Rich was talking about. We just wanted to learn about the volunteers' experience. And this narrative approach of storytelling, it just isn't prescriptive. It all stemmed from a homogeneous storyline because we all shared the desire to help and provide support to frontline workers. But each one of us had a different role on Maine Frontline Warm Line. Someone was a founder, somebody was on faculty, some people just answered calls, some people just did outreach, some people met with stakeholders. And the narratives just speak to one point in time during the pandemic. And the story really isn't complete. And we're trying to figure out what happened and what we've learned and what might be useful for a future disaster response. And the narratives were amazing from both the first and the second survey. And we built the research and put qualitative analysis in the process. And each narrative volunteer is really worthy of exploration. So we just followed the narratives. What did the narratives tell us? The themes and the storylines.
Thanks, Poppy.
So we're talking about characters and we're talking about stories. Let me ask my co-presenter, what is your story? How did you come to volunteer in this effort?
Well, I'll go really quickly. I got a call from a colleague at Maine Medical Center. She and I and one other colleague had been working on Maine Med's disaster behavioral health plan for a number of years. And when she called, I just said yes. She didn't even get the sentence out. I knew nothing about it, didn't know what I was going to be doing. It was a way to use the skill set that I developed and hopefully to make it better for what we were all facing. That was it.
I'll jump in. I actually volunteered because my father at age 25 during the pandemic of 1918 was a foreman of a crew of about 30 young men, and they were building the outside staging of the Texas building company, shipping company, which is now BIW. And they all lived together in a rooming house in Bath. And all but 3 of his workers died during the pandemic. And he carried unspoken until he was late into his 80s, the trauma and the guilt of surviving, the sadness and the grief. And he also traveled to visit every single one of those young men's families, and he never, ever told anybody about it. So when the Maine chapter of NASW sent out a notice that there was an opportunity to volunteer, really, we were just connecting with Maine Response at that time, and it wasn't even named Maine Frontline Warm Line at that point. And for me, it was really obvious that this was a way for me to honor my father's experience and hopefully provide support to frontline workers and their stories in the moment, not years later.
Susie.
I can jump in. So this is a question that has many answers, and they're all very important. I can remember in the early days of the pandemic going, what can I do? And it was just eating at me. I was thinking, I have a background in EMS. I am a social worker. I've had experience working with people after critical incidents. Surely there must be something. And again, where I was out cross-country skiing. We stopped for a moment. I looked at my phone. I saw this email from the Maine NASW asking for volunteers in this project that hadn't quite yet it was unfolding. And Ed was the one unfolding it and developing it. And I was thinking, oh, other people are making masks, or other people are delivering needed items, or other people are going to their essential frontline jobs. Surely there must be another way to assist, because I think it gets in our blood for many of us that when there's a disaster, it's like, how can I help? What needs to be done? So this was why I responded to it. And as I reflected on it more, I thought, oh my gosh, I had a small part to play back in the day of the ice storm. I sat with leadership in fire department in my community after 9/11. And there have been 1 or 2 other situations that involved a lot of response that I've been able to participate in over the years. And that just knowing that they were pulling together people with a desire to help, common interests, background, willing to be trained, was what pulled me into the Maine Frontline Warm Line.
And I'm happy to go next. I got involved initially when I saw that I received a newsletter, an educational newsletter that goes out statewide to all educators, talking about this effort that was happening and looking for educators who might be interested in joining the effort. So that's how I initially got involved. My background in K-12 counseling and school administration, I thought could be useful, and that after meeting the group of people who had started this effort, I felt completely comfortable in taking the PFA, the psychological first aid training, and then felt I was up on board. And following that, through the process, I also had the support of the full group that I was working with, because we were available to each other at all times practically. And that's how I got involved, to see what I had to offer, what I could offer to those in need, particularly frontline. Anyone, after I had the training, I felt confident to take the phone calls.
Well, I guess I'll add my story. I've always been interested in doing things that could be useful, particularly in multidisciplinary teams. And so starting with anxiety disorders at the University of Hawaii, I then went on to Pittsburgh and started working with PTSD, and then with mass casualty disaster. The survivors of a unit that survived a Scud missile blast in the Persian Gulf War, and other disasters, hurricanes, other things. I felt here was an opportunity when COVID came to meet great people and to do something to contribute here in Maine. And it was that's one of the most wonderful experiences of my life, meeting these folks, working with them in the front line. So should we go on to talk about what we learned?
So I'll take a stab at this one. The words are a lot like the formula on the right-hand side of the screen. There are a lot of them. They're big and they're complex, and it's hard to put them together in a basic sentence. To describe what we noticed as calling was incredibly challenging. The literature on calling is pretty dense. It comes from a diverse bunch of areas of interest and study, theology, business. There are generally considered to be two approaches, the neoclassical and the modern. The neoclassical, why it's called that, I don't know, focuses on an external call. Someone asked me to do something. The more modern version of calling is some version of, even if somebody asks you to do something or you see an external need, it's touching something in you that activates a response. I must respond to this. And so you can probably tell some of my theoretical orientation is heavy in the language here, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. However, we look at a calling as a dynamic, as a relational dynamic. And I think that's a theme you're going to see in most of our working definitions between individual and context. So calling was one of the first things that we noticed in the literature that came through as a theme very clearly. And we just simply wanted to understand more of what has been written about it. And we definitely, I think we would agree, fall more on the modern definition, where it's coming from internally. It's an internal response, which then gets activated behaviorally to a specific need or situation. Somebody else want to jump in on that? You're stunned.
Well, I think the important piece, Rich, that you're really connecting with is that it's in an internal space, and it's an internal process that goes on in terms of calling. So that, to me, that's a key piece to calling.
It's the
I
engine
think I
that
named
drives
it.
us. Yeah.
And I think I named it as it gets in your blood.
Yeah. Yep.
Ed, I'm not sure if I heard you say that's the secret sauce.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, that was a phrase that we used a lot trying to understand what we were doing. And when we felt it was working, and that notion of the secret sauce, don't tell anybody what it is, it drove drove every one of our volunteers. That's why they came. That's why they stayed. We were able to it sounds like a possession task. People stayed for an extraordinarily long period of time, serving, doing shifts, with not always a lot of calls to answer. So there wasn't a lot of payback for actually doing what you hoped you'd be able to do. But the calling, I think, sustained people during those periods of time. And I think I'll go a little bit further. My hunch is that proactive pro-social work on a calling is something of a protective factor in this kind of a context, in a long duration pandemic context. I also think it would work in a shorter duration context. But we had people that stayed for the entire run of the Maine Frontline Warm Line before it was taken over by the state. And one of our favorite questions that we used to ask is a deceptively simple one. And it was what we concluded each survey with was, how are you doing? And everybody said they were okay. And my hunch is, I don't have, clear quantitative data to support this, but my guess is that the calling was a supportive dynamic that kept people engaged, and that has a byproduct of, in the answering of that calling or responding to the calling, that's protective at a deeply human level. Should we move on?
And We created this community who had this shared calling or very similar types of calling. And as we've mentioned, we had check-ins, which you could go to at one point, 7 afternoons a week. Then we just did during the weekdays. And then we eventually, I think, had 3 afternoons a week, but we always had somebody on call 24/7 if somebody took a call, was struggling with it, or just needed to talk to one of us. And I think that this opportunity to show up and be with people that you'd met, even though we were on Zoom, shared this calling, was it was a silver lining for many of us during such rough days as we were trying to absorb the news or any impacts COVID had personally near us.
And I think
And-
you're right, Susie. It was the actual culture that supported the calling, that it provided the space for us all to show up with our calling, the culture. And as you were saying about Zoom, I think it made, I mean, the culture became very human. With Zoom, we really got to see how each other lived and we connected with each other. We got to see puppies that were purchased during COVID, and birds and cats and dogs, and whether people were reorganizing their living rooms or their office space. But it was a very important way to support the calling.
And I think without having named it initially as calling, this is something that we came to in the data. One thing that was structurally woven into, or the other metaphor we would use a lot is baked into the process of the Maine Frontline Warm Line, was nurturing that sense of calling. That was a very active process. We may not have known the language for it at the time, but we were actively cultivating people's desire to be helpful and supporting that as best we could. And that's a rather remarkable thing about this model, is that it, again, is very, very specifically encouraging, supporting, nourishing that individual calling, and then taking that and having it applied to a situation, as opposed to the situation saying you need to do this. Let's go to the next one. There are lots of definitions of systemic betrayal in the literature, and largely nobody agrees on any one. So we thought, why not? We'll write our own. And after, I think, months of discussion back and forth and over time, this is one of the ones that we landed on. Please notice that the second sentence is from our writing so far, and it's draft form. It may change. But I think it's an important definition from our understanding of what our volunteers experience sometimes when we didn't have buy-in from some of our stakeholders in terms of supporting what we were doing, and also what we were hearing from the frontline personnel that were calling, how they were not being supported. And the pandemic was hard enough, but to be doing it while you're actively not being supported or inhibited by your system was a particularly injurious phenomenon. Anybody else want to join in on systemic betrayal? It's such a fun topic. Well, I think one of the things that we have come to in a lot of our discussions, which I wish we could get all of our research meeting discussions published as its own kind of work. You could see the evolution of a lot of these contexts or constructs. Is one of the things we're looking at is sustainability, taking care of us so that we are able to be responsive and be productive, but also to support people who themselves are sustainably involved in their lives. And our big observation is that this goes to, like, I think, future directions a little bit. But really, we can't build professions or occupations in which there is no reciprocal care responsibility. It just can't be the individual serving the organization all the time. It has to be taking care of each other. And that's what we were modeling in the Maine Frontline Warm Line, Maine Frontline Connection, was taking care of each other. That was a structural tenet of the process.
And I was just reading a comment that was sent by one of our volunteers, and it really was the relational connections that we all developed with each other. In addition to the training and all check-ins, we took responsibility for taking care of each other. And that was a real part of the relational model.
The whole thing was just so multifaceted when you think about the entire process leading up to the comment you just made, Poppy. It was just such a thoroughly well done. I don't even think it wasn't exactly planned each step along the way. We didn't know how it would unfold. And yet I think attributed to the quality of the group involved, their professionalism, their knowledge, skill, and ability to be trained, flexibility, the willingness to help, and what developed among us was just very enjoyable and very rewarding, I would say.
And I think you made a good point, John. Often we didn't know what was going to come next and what the next steps were, but we trusted amongst ourselves and we built a relationship that we could connect with each other, not knowing often what the next steps would be. Somebody just typed something in the chat in terms of what MFLC stands for, Maine Frontline Connection.
And the Maine Frontline Connection grew out of the Maine Frontline Warm Line when those of us continued to pursue ways that we could be supportive with the information that we had learned. And that led us to the research, and the research led us to the case study, which we are weaving in today.
Thank you so much for bringing that to our attention.
So on the next slide, moral injury is one of those constructs that also has gotten quite a bit of attention in the literature. It largely started in the, I would say, the early 2000s with one seminal piece of writing on combat-related trauma. So some of it came from the military, but that experience of being involved, either witnessing or participating in something that violates one's moral or value code, is and can be potentially quite injurious. It leaves people with an awful lot of, I don't know what a word for that would be. There's a big suitcase full of hard stuff to deal with, whether it's guilt, shame, physical. I mean, you can actually get physical response from it. And that wasn't really being attended to when we asked people to do hard things that are against their basic moral code. An example, perhaps, from the COVID time was a frontline provider who was asked to continue to do shift after shift after shift, and also was worried about bringing any of that potential biohazard back to their family. And that crosses into systemic betrayal, that they were asked to be put in that situation. But if you're a physician, let's say, and you want to attend, in your attending, you then possibly create a risk vector for your family or people that you know and care about. And so how do you balance those two dimensions? And that's a really complex dynamic that's constantly shifting. And again, our draft definition goes back to that relational approach, which comes largely from one of the people who's on the call today. Thank you, Paula. Is that it is a relational definition. And that's what we're trying to get at. Is that it's a contextually grounded relationship between someone's values or morals and a transgression of those morals or values, and what happens as a response. That's what moral injury is, as we see it. There were many examples that we heard from callers during the pandemic.
And that people, Rich, could be experiencing both of that, both moral
Absolutely.
and systemic betrayal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ed?
So I think I've just had a chance to reflect. I happen to be overseas as we're doing this. And so a few moments ago, suddenly the screen went dark, the room went dark. I was here in the dark, internet went down, and I was reflecting on, who it is that I was with my team. And that one of the things that I'd learned was that we never worry alone. And that there is a tremendous sense of trust that you develop with people given the opportunity to work together like this. And that I knew things were going to be okay, that certainly my colleagues could manage this whole thing. And that notion of never worrying alone is a part of the culture that's given me great comfort and great satisfaction. That said, let me introduce a main finding of our study, this case study that we've done, having a chance now to study for 2 years what our volunteers went through, what they could tell us about COVID. We learned that an organization that honors the volunteers' individual sense of calling, that promotes this culture of learning, self-care, authentic respect, concern for others, never worry alone, that group can develop a resilient, highly effective effort that can sustain itself even in the face of a global pandemic and systemic betrayal. That was a tremendous finding for us. And we think, frankly, what we've learned, we hope that that's going to have value for you and for others that face different challenges in the future.
So one of the areas that we keep touching on is, so what to go to now? Where do we go from here? Well, I think one of the things that I am happiest with about Maine Frontline Warm Line is that at the end of it, even if we had not answered one call, we had invited and participated in training 150 of our colleagues in psychological first aid. That's a remarkable resource for the state of Maine. And these are all folks who are already involved in the highest levels of clinical care in the state, that they now have added that tool to their toolkit was really remarkable. And that it was done as easily and quickly and effectively as possible, given the context. People still committed time to doing it. These were all very busy folks that gave up hours of their time to participate in the training. But we ended up with this remarkable asset. I would like to think that the response that happened to the Lewiston event was positively impacted by what the entire state has learned during COVID. I'm not saying that's a justification for Lewiston in any way, shape, or form, but the response of the state when COVID first came, it wasn't as profound as it is now. So I think that needs to be more structurally woven. I know the Office of Disaster Behavioral Health is continually offering PFA trainings and inviting people to participate in Maine Responds, which can deploy individuals to various settings. Poppy, for example, is very involved with the Red Cross. There are a number of organizations that people can participate with, but I think to keep building a capacity for a response in a disaster is one of the things that's certainly needed. I think one of the ways to begin with that is looking at our own disciplines and asking, there's no way to ask this of everybody that's on the call right now, but how many of you had coursework specific to disaster? I didn't. We had crisis. That's different than disaster. Guy, you raised your hand. Go ahead. You need to unmute. You still need to unmute.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Coursework in some of the EMDR training that I did, level 2 has critical incident stress debriefing, which was, I thought, fantastic. But was able to later on go on and do the psychological first aid training as well.
Awesome. I'm glad you mentioned EMDR. There's a group of clinicians who are forming a resource group that's available to provide pro bono EMDR work in the state, and particularly using some new work, I think that started out of Israel on a very rapid introduction of EMDR into the PFA process. That's kind of a separate technological modality, but that idea that we have a lot of people who are willing to and are expanding our training in how we respond to disasters of any kind. The key to the disaster response training is it has to be all hazard. It's not just pandemic response, it's every kind of response. And that's the training that I think we need to get people involved in earlier. If it were up to me and I had the keys to the universe, you wouldn't graduate from high school unless you had PFA and advanced first aid. But that's why I'm not going to get elected as president of the universe. But I think those skill sets are amazingly available and incredibly helpful. Incredibly helpful.
Rich, I would add mental health first aid training through NAMI.
Absolutely.
Mandatory.
Absolutely. Yep. Excellent. Thank you for that. Let's see, Janelle. Janelle. You have your hand up?
It's Jan Frost, and I have been a volunteer with the American Red Cross for 22 years, and we offer psychological first aid, all hazard. And we do offer it to the community. We can go out to community groups, parishes is one, churches we've done, and some first responder groups. And that's the primary intervention strategy that the American Red Cross has used for well over 20 years. And we have been working on the Lewiston operation, as has Poppy, and we're doing, as we speak, the FBI vetted people that were directly impacted, not the ones that had fatalities. Of course, they were directly impacted, but over 100 people were identified as directly impacted by the FBI, and disaster mental health volunteers for the American Red Cross are busy calling them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan.
Ed, do you want to cover the last bit of topic there?
Yeah, so I'm a physician, and I'm really intrigued by what we can learn from how the mind and the body respond to stress over time, how we can foster resilience. We seem to have had a really resilient group of people going through this, and there are ways in which we can take a look at the impact of long stress on state anxiety, state depression, cognition, memory. There are ways that we can look at that and even look at chemical markers, cortisol and other markers, to see what the impact is on people's health, on their sleep and self-care, I think is something that is really worth exploring. Because I think one of the things COVID taught us, COVID lasted a long time. Some of the disasters I've responded to before, plane crashes, other sorts of things, certainly have had big impacts on communities. But COVID lasted for a very long time. And as we're facing climate-related issues, other sorts of hazards, being prepared for those situations in which we need stamina, we need to be able to put up an effort that'll maintain over time. We need to understand how that works. So I think there's a real opportunity, and maybe some of you will help us, help us understand what is it that really helps us to stay healthy, to stay engaged, to stay with that calling that allows us to be able to meet the needs of the community as long as it takes.
I think just to wrap up this slide and to move to the next topic, we don't need to look very hard to see that healthcare, first responder, EMS, and educational systems have all suffered with respect to retention of personnel during COVID. I think a rough guesstimate is we lost about 30% of people, if not more, or capacity during COVID. And that has not bounced back very easily. And that's something that I think we need to take a better look at and respond to more adaptively than we have thus far. So at this point, Casey or Chris, I thought I saw you log in. We're going to do the breakout rooms in just about 30 seconds. Do we have any other questions that we can answer at this point? I hesitate to jump up to the chat.
You did have a question, Richard, from someone asking about the contact info for the group doing critical incident EMDR.
Yes, that would be with Celia Grant. And if you probably just go to her website and send her an email, I'm sure she'd be able to collect you in on that process. Celia Grant, LCSW, absolutely wonderful clinician.
You said you lost 30% of workers during the COVID?
That's a general loose guesstimate of health losses in healthcare staff, educational staff, and first responder. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to get the breakout room started, and just as a heads up, Richard, I'm going to stop the recording right now since we're about to go into the breakout rooms. Do you need it to start when we come back, or is it okay to end it for here?
No, I think we can end it here.
Okay.